Former President of the United States, Donald Trump, has been shot. Now, my friends, I know for a lot of you that are watching this video right now, this is probably something that is not a surprise. This is coming many days after the event actually took place. And mind you, this is not the first time that an assassination attempt on the former president has actually occurred, but we will be getting into that more a bit later once we go into the history of all this. In this particular case that we're talking about, though, Trump was rushed off stage with blood dripping from his face after gunshots rang out at a rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. Unfortunately, one spectator at the rally would die, and two are in serious condition. Trump would say that he was shot in the ear, and an email would be sent out late on Saturday night when his campaign team would quote him as saying, quote, "I will never surrender." In regards to the incident, Secret Service spokesman Anthony Guglielmi would say in a statement that the suspected shooter, who officials confirmed is dead, had fired multiple shots towards the stage at approximately 6:15 p.m. He would say that the shooter was in an elevated position outside of the rally. This whole thing is truly insane. Trump had reached for his ear as noise would erupt inside of the rally, and attendees at it began to scream as agents had pushed him to the ground. And yet, despite the chaos, the former president was removed from the site by Secret Service with his fist raised in what I'm sure that many people are probably seeing already on the internet is perhaps one of the most iconic photos that we will likely see in the 21st century. As of this moment, the FBI is launching a full-scale investigation into this event that will more than likely go down in the history books. Whether you're looking at this from a geopolitical perspective, whether you're looking at this from a historical perspective or a political or however you want to talk about this, on this channel, we have talked about assassinations, we have talked about corruption, we have talked about many dirty things, but it is still always a shock when something like this occurs in real time. And on that note, I will say this right now. To those who are watching this, I ask that you please keep your comments civil. I already know what kind of things we are likely going to be seeing in the comments section, as already rumors and conspiracy theories are popping up all across the internet. I make it a personal mission of mine, and I have said this before, that I will not tell people what to think. But that being said, no matter where it is that you fall on the political aisle, I would advise that you control what you say. Think on it like this. Do you really want to live in a world where political violence is normal and cheered on? Considering how many crises and disasters within geopolitics that we have talked about on this channel, I would strongly advise against it. Because, my friends, the potential ramifications of this assassination attempt are massive. And depending on how American elections go this year, it will likely affect policy, both foreign and domestic. There's really little else that I can say at this moment, as anything that I do would simply just be speculation. And we don't really have any other info to work off of, and it would be irresponsible of me to do more. But that being said, do you have any idea just how many assassination attempts there have been on presidents in US history? The answer might honestly surprise you, because it is more than you would think. To that end, in light of recent events, I figured that we should go ahead and take a step back and go through them one by one so you can see exactly what it is that I am talking about. While perhaps not every single thing that could be talked about here will be covered, let's go ahead and start from the beginning with George Washington. Now, technically speaking, this is not when Washington was president or after it, but it still does count in my opinion. In June of 1776, General George Washington had ordered the arrest of David Matthews, the loyalist mayor of New York City, for conspiring to support British plans to invade the city and strike the Continental Army there. It was later learned that Matthews was also involved in a plot against Washington, along with an individual by the name of William Tyrone, this being the British-appointed governor of New York. The conspirators aimed to capture or assassinate Washington using traitors in his Life Guard, which is the detachment of soldiers that are responsible for the general safety. They, in the end, were foiled by the Committee for Detecting and Defeating Conspiracies, which was led by John Jay, who would later gain fame as a founding father, diplomat, and jurist. The reason that we talk about this case here is that it stars an individual by the name of Thomas Hickey, the Continental soldier who was at the center of the plot and was a favorite of Washington. He was an Irishman and a British Army deserter who had joined the colonial militia in Connecticut and was later handpicked by Washington to join his elite Life Guards. That being said, Hickey ended up proving to be a bit of a disappointment and was later jailed on suspicion of counterfeiting. While he was detained, he would confide to fellow prisoners that he was turning his back on the cause of independence and was then actively trying to recruit other people to support the British. Hickey was court-martialed for his role in the plot against Washington, and he would plead innocent to charges of exciting and joining in mutiny and sedition, as well as treacherously corresponding and enlisting among and receiving pay from the enemies of the United Colonies. In the end, he was found guilty on June 26, 1776, and 2 days later, He was hung in New York City before 20,000 onlookers. He was the first individual to be executed for treason against what would become the United States. By Washington's orders, all soldiers who were not on duty at the time were to be present at the execution. And Washington would later write a letter to the Continental Congress saying, quote, "I am hopeful this example will produce many salutary consequences and deter others from entering into the traitorous practices." This would be the first, but many more were to follow. After that, we have to wait for a number of years before it is that we get to Andrew Jackson. For anyone who knows his story, he had the distinct habit of, well, pissing off a lot of people, both back in his day, and even depending upon where you look at it in the internet, a lot today. On January 30th, 1835, Andrew Jackson became the first American president to experience a proper assassination attempt, you could say. Richard Lawrence, an unemployed house painter, had approached Jackson as he left a congressional funeral that was held in the White Chamber of the Capitol building, and he shot at him. But when he did this, his gun misfired. A furious 67-year-old Jackson would confront his attacker and proceeded to club him several times with his walking cane. During the scuffle, Lawrence managed to pull out a second pistol and pull the trigger, but this also misfired. Jackson's aides would then wrestle Lawrence away from the president, leaving him unharmed, and after that, incredibly paranoid. The amazing thing about this, when we talk about this incident, is that Lawrence was more than likely incredibly mentally unstable, and he had no actual connection to Jackson's political rivals. But Jackson was convinced that Lawrence had been hired by the Whig Party to assassinate him, these being his political opponents. At the time, Jackson's Democrats and the Whigs were locked in a battle over Jackson's attempt to dismantle the Bank of the United States. His vice president, Martin Van Buren, was also extremely wary thereafter and would keep loaded pistols with him whenever he would visit the Senate. Still though, Jackson's suspicions were never actually proven, and Lawrence would spend the rest of his life in a mental institution. It was later determined that the odds of both guns misfiring during the assassination attempt was 1 in 125,000. Which in turn mean that despite all the odds against him, Andrew Jackson would not become the first president to be assassinated. No, that instead would be Abraham Lincoln. Of course, while we know how that does go for Lincoln, there were several attempts on his life prior to this. There would be a very real event in August of 1864 when a lone rifle shot that was fired by an unknown sniper would manage to miss Lincoln's head by mere inches and would pass through his hat. This being as he rode in the late evening, unguarded, north from the White House, 3 miles to the Soldiers' Home, which was his regular retreat where he would work and sleep before returning to the White House the following morning. Though the incident was terrifying, ultimately, a shooter would never be captured in this instance. And of course, we do know how things actually do go with Abraham Lincoln, as he was the first U.S. president to actually be assassinated, with the assassination taking place on Good Friday, April 14th, 1865, at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. The assassin, John Wilkes Booth, was a well-known actor and a Confederate sympathizer from Maryland, though he had never actually went and joined the Confederate Army. In 1864, a year before the actual assassination, Booth had formulated a plan to not kill Lincoln, but to instead kidnap him in exchange for the release of Confederate prisoners. After attending an April 11th, 1865 speech, though, in which Lincoln promoted voting rights for individuals who were black, Booth would ultimately change his mind and decided to instead assassinate the president. Learning that the president would be attending Ford's Theater, Booth would formulate a plan with co-conspirators to assassinate Lincoln, as well as Vice President Andrew Johnson and Secretary of State William H. Seward at their homes. The plot against Lincoln would ultimately succeed when Wilkes would manage to get into his booth and aim a .44 caliber Derringer pistol at the back of Lincoln's head. After remaining in a coma for 9 hours, Lincoln would ultimately die at 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, making him the first president to be assassinated. The next assassination to bring up on this list is that of James A. Garfield, the 20th President of the United States, whose assassination would begin at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. at 9:20 a.m. on Saturday, July 2nd, 1881, this being less than 4 months after he had taken office. The incident, as it went down, is that as the president was arriving at the train station, there was a writer and lawyer by the name of Charles Guiteau, who would shoot him with a revolver, with one bullet having grazed the president's shoulder and the other piercing his back. The crazy thing about this, when we talk about this event, is that he didn't immediately die. For the next 11 weeks, Garfield would endure massive amounts of pain and suffering from having been shot before ultimately dying on September 19th, 1881 at 10:35 p.m. This being due to a series of complications that came from infections, which, mind you, had been contracted because of the doctor's relentless use of unsterilized fingers and instruments when trying to check the president's wounds. Yes, that is right. The president of the United States ended up dying from an infection that should have been easily preventable because the doctor refused to wash his hands. Yes, medical technology and understandings of things were not exactly the best at this point in history, and that is merely 140 years ago. Garfield had survived a total of 79 days after being shot. Of course, Guiteau was immediately arrested, and after a highly publicized trial that would last from November to January, he was found guilty and ultimately sentenced to death. As for why he did any of this in the first place, Guiteau was assessed during his trial and autopsy as mentally unbalanced or suffering from the effects of neurosyphilis, which, yes, for anyone unaware, syphilis, especially throughout history when untreated, would eventually make you go crazy. He claimed to have shot Garfield out of disappointment at being passed over for appointment as ambassador to France, and he would even attribute the president's victory in his election to a speech that he had wrote supporting Garfield. Does it make sense? No, but then again, you're going to find that that is the case for a lot of the people in this list. Next up, not too long after that, we have the assassination of United States President William McKinley, which took place at 4:07 p.m. on Friday, September 6th, 1901, at the Temple of Music in Buffalo, New York. McKinley, who was attending the Pan American Exposition, was shot twice in the abdomen at close range by an anarchist who was armed with a .32 caliber revolver that he had kept concealed underneath a handkerchief. The first bullet would ricochet off either a button or an award medal on McKinley's jacket and would lodge in his sleeves, but the second shot would pierce his stomach. Although McKinley initially appeared to recover from his attack, his condition would rapidly deteriorate due to gangrene setting in around his wounds, and from this infection, he would die on September 14th, 1901. This is at a time in US and world history in which anarchism is on the rise, an ideology which wanted to take down these systems of government of, well, pretty much anyone. A ruler, a president, a king, literally anything, it did not matter. If they were in charge, they needed to die. And so on September 24th, after a 2-day trial in which the defendant refused to actually defend himself, he was executed by the electric chair in Auburn Prison on October 29th, 1901. And while it is clear that his actions were most certainly politically motivated, there really is no guess as to what he actually thought would happen afterwards. That's kind of the problem that would end up happening with anarchism throughout history. Interesting detail, it is actually following President McKinley's assassination that Congress would direct the Secret Service to protect the President of the United States as part of its mandate. That is what would happen there. Either way, next up on this list, we have good old Teddy Roosevelt, or rather we would, as he took office after McKinley was assassinated, but before him, we actually have his protege and then rival Taft, who was actually the target of an assassination attempt before him. You see, my friends, in the year 1909, William Howard Taft and Porfirio Diaz, yes, the president/dictator of Mexico, had planned a summit in El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua, which was a historic first meeting between a U.S. president and a Mexican president, and also the first time that any American president had actually crossed the border into Mexico. It was a very big deal. The whole reason as to why Diaz had requested the meeting was to show U.S. support for his planned 8th run as president, something that in his own country, considering what I have done previous episodes when talking on my actual history podcast about the Mexican Revolution, you can probably guess as to why that was pretty important. Well, Taft had agreed to support Diaz in order to protect several $billion of American capital that had been invested in Mexico. Neither side wanted anything to go wrong, and both sides would agree that the disputed Chismal Strip that was connecting El Paso to Ciudad Juarez would be considered neutral territory with no flags present during the summit. But the issue was that the amount of attention that was brought to this location meant that assassination threats were rampant. As a result, the Texas Rangers, 4,000 U.S. and Mexican troops, as well as U.S. Secret Service agents, FBI agents, and U.S. Marshals were all called in order to try and provide security. It is then on October 16th, the day of the summit, that a Texas Ranger would discover 52-year-old Julius Bergensen, who was holding a concealed palm pistol and standing at the El Paso Chamber of Commerce building along the procession route. This individual would be captured and disarmed only a few feet in front of Taft and Diaz, which in turn, from what we are talking about here, possibly stopped an attempted assassination, though he never got to raise his fist to try and fire, and from that, a massive international incident. Though, that being said, it still does bring us after this to Teddy Roosevelt. Because you see, my friends, 3.5 years after he had left office, Theodore Roosevelt would run in the 1912 presidential election as a member of the Progressive Party. While campaigning in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on October 14th, 1912, John Schrank, who was a saloon keeper from New York, who had been stalking him for weeks, would shoot Roosevelt once in the chest. As it happens, the 50-page text of his campaign speech that was folded over twice in his breast pocket, as well as a metal glasses container, would end up slowing the bullet to the point that it would save Roosevelt's life. Schrank was immediately disarmed, captured, and might have been lynched by the crowd had Roosevelt not shouted at them to stop and that he needed to remain unharmed. That in and of itself is pretty impressive, but more impressive was that Roosevelt, as a very experienced hunter and man, had concluded that since he was not coughing up blood, that the bullet hadn't actually reached his lung. And so instead of going to the hospital like his aides requested that he do, instead he would deliver his scheduled speech with blood seeping out from his shirt. He would speak for 84 minutes before completing his speech and accepting medical attention, with his opening comments to the gathered crowd being, "Ladies and gentlemen, I don't know whether you fully understand that I have been shot, but it takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Always so impressive, Teddy. For anyone who is then wondering as to why Schrank did this, what was going on, at his trial, the would-be assassin would claim that William McKinley had actually visited him in a dream and had told him that he needed to avenge his assassination by killing Roosevelt. So from that the only reason that Roosevelt became president after McKinley was because Roosevelt had planned the original assassination. And so from this, as you can imagine, from him receiving death orders in a dream, he was found legally insane and was then institutionalized until his death in 1943. Next up on this list, that would bring us to Herbert Hoover. On November 19th, 1928, President-elect Hoover would embark on a 10-nation goodwill tour of Central and South America. It was then while he was crossing the Andes Mountains from Chile that an assassination plot by Argentinian anarchists was thwarted. Yes, my friends, thwarted. This group had planned to blow up his train as it crossed the Argentinian Central Plain. The plotters had an itinerary, but the bomber was ultimately arrested before they could actually place their explosives on the rails. And while normally this would be a great cause for concern, Hoover was more interested in having his wife not learn about what had happened. And so when the front page of the newspaper in big bold letters talked about the plot, he proceeded to tear the front page away and say it's just as well that Lou, his wife, shouldn't see it. On a side note here, if that was ever a situation that I would be in, yeah, I would probably do the same in front of my wife. She is looking at me right now. After Hoover, then, we have Franklin D. Roosevelt. On February 15th, 1933, 17 days before Roosevelt's first presidential inauguration, Giuseppe Zangara would fire 5 shots at Roosevelt in Miami, Florida. Now, Zangara's shots would miss the presidential-elect, but he did manage to mortally wound Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak and would injure 4 other people. Zangara would ultimately plead guilty to the murder of Cermak and was executed in the electric chair on March 20th, 1933. Interestingly enough, it has never actually been conclusively proven or determined who Zangara's real target was. I mean, after all, he was shooting in the direction of the President of the United States, as most people would probably assume. But another theory is that the attempt might have actually been ordered by the imprisoned Al Capone, and that the target was Cernak, who had led a crackdown on the Chicago outfit and Chicago organized crime. Will we ever know? Probably not. But following him, we have President Harry S. Truman. On November 1st, 1950, 2 Puerto Rican pro-independence activists by the name of Oscar Collazo as well as Griseo Terrasola would attempt to kill President Truman at the Blair House, this being the place where Truman was living while the White House was going through a series of renovations. In the attack, the two would end up getting in a shootout with police officers, with one of them being killed and the other being shot in the stomach and having to then go to the hospital. Truman was ultimately not harmed, but at the time he was placed at huge risk. Collazo was ultimately convicted at a federal trial and would receive the death sentence. But Truman would commute Collazo's death sentence to life in prison, and in 1979, Jimmy Carter would later actually commute his sentence to time served. Following this, that would bring us to John F. Kennedy, which I'm sure that many people from the beginning are probably going to say, oh yes, it's Kennedy. Kennedy being assassinated in Dallas. Yes, but also no. there was actually an incident that would occur prior to his actual assassination. On December 11th, 1960, while vacationing in Palm Beach, Florida, President-elect John F. Kennedy was threatened by a man called Richard Paul Pavlik, a 73-year-old former postal worker who was driven by hatred of Catholics. What Pavlik intended to do was to crash his dynamite-laden 1950 Buick into Kennedy's vehicle, but ultimately, he would not do this. He would change his mind after seeing Kennedy's wife and daughter bid him goodbye, which made him second-guess and question himself. Ironically, he would end up getting arrested 3 days later by Secret Service after being stopped for a driving violation, and police would find the dynamite in his car and arrest him. As for what ultimately would happen to him, on January 27, 1961, Pavlik was committed to the United States Public Health Service Mental Hospital in Springfield, Missouri, and was then indicted for threatening Kennedy's life 7 weeks later. Interestingly enough, charges against him were dropped on December 2, 1963, this being 10 days after Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. He was determined in the end that he was incapable of distinguishing between right and wrong, and as a result, he was kept in a mental hospital. The federal government would ultimately drop charges in August of 1964, and he was later released in 1966. Considering that in this previous example, I already mentioned it, I'm not going to be going into details, but of course, as we know, Kennedy got assassinated in Dallas. I'm sure many of you are already aware, so we're going to move on beyond that. The next one up on this list, Richard Nixon, an individual who had quite a number of enemies. On April 13th, 1972, a man by the name of Arthur Bremer carried a firearm to a motorcade in Ottawa, Canada, with the intention to shoot Nixon. But when this happened, the president's car went by so fast that Bremer was not actually able to get off a good shot. This was pretty lucky, and the next day, Bremer continued the chase, thinking that he had seen Nixon's car outside of the center block. But ultimately, by the time that he ran back to get his gun from his hotel room, the car was gone. He had failed to kill Nixon, but he wasn't just going to go home doing nothing. Only a month later, he would instead go and shoot and seriously injure the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, who was ultimately paralyzed from the waist down until his death in 1998. 3 other people would end up being wounded in this attack, and Bremer would end up serving 35 years in prison. Another incident would occur with Nixon on February 22, 1974, where Samuel Bick would plan to kill Nixon by crashing a commercial airliner into the White House. In order to do this, he hijacked a DC-9 at the Baltimore-Washington International Airport after killing a Maryland Aviation Administration police officer, and was told that it could not actually take off, like the plane could not take off because it had wheel blocks that were still in place. After he would shoot both of the pilots, with one of them later dying, an officer would ultimately manage to kill him by shooting him through the window. Or rather, he would shoot him, and then he would still have enough life in him to be able to self-delete himself afterwards. Almost immediately after, this all would be followed by President Gerald Ford. In mid-August of 1974, Miriam Kerbegovic, also known as the Alphabet Bomber, would say in a message that he was going to come to Washington, D.C. and throw a nerve gas bomb at President Gerald Ford, who, mind you, at this point, was only 10 days into actually serving as president. Within just a single day, the CIA, the U.S. Secret Service, and other law enforcement agencies managed to go and identify Kerbegovic, who was ultimately arrested on August 20th. From this, he was unable to carry out his actual attack. And while this is pretty crazy, it does not end for Gerald Ford there. On September 5th, 1975, on the northern grounds of the California State Capitol, a woman by the name of Lynette Fromm, who is a follower of Charles Manson, which honestly, that is probably something that deserves its own episode that we're going to need to cover, managed to draw a Colt 1911 .45 caliber pistol on Ford when he reached to shake her hand in a crowd. While she did have 4 cartridges in the magazine, there was none actually in the firing chamber. So as a result, when she tried to fire the gun, it did not work, and she was quickly restrained by Secret Service agents and was sentenced to life in prison. This would be the first time that a woman had actually tried to assassinate the president. But what is even more crazy than that is that on September 22nd, 1975, only 17 days after Fromm's attempt, a woman by the name of Sarah Jane Moore would fire a revolver at Ford from 40 feet away. A bystander would manage to grab Moore's arm, and the shot would miss him, instead striking a building wall and slightly injuring a taxi driver. Moore was captured and was then convicted in federal court and sentenced to prison for life. The two assassination attempts that we've talked about, which is crazy that it happened to one president, both in September of 1975, they are the only two known assassination cases of a woman trying to take out an American president. I'm not going to draw any conclusions on what that means about Gerald Ford and specifically what he was about, but feel free to comment something. After that, though, we have Jimmy Carter. On May 5th, 1979, in what is most certainly a very weird case, you have an individual by the name of Raymond Lee Harvey, an Ohio-born unemployed American drifter. He would be arrested by Secret Service after being found carrying a starter pistol that was filled with blank rounds. This being only 10 minutes before Carter was set to give a speech at the Civic Center Mall in Los Angeles on May 5th, 1979. Harvey, as it turns out, had a history of mental illness, just as many people in this list did. But despite the weird circumstances in which he was captured, police still had to investigate his claim that he wasn't alone, that he was actually part of a four-man team that was trying to assassinate the president. Yes, you heard me right. It gets pretty weird. According to Harvey, he fired 7 blank rounds from the starter pistol on his hotel roof on the night of May 4th in order to test and see just how much noise the pistol would actually make. He would also claim to have been with one of the plotters that night, whom he only knew as Julio, though this man would later be identified as a 21-year-old illegal immigrant from Mexico by the name of Osvaldo Espinoza Ortiz. The circumstances, as you can probably guess, were very weird, and the evidence, if any, sporadic. Charges were ultimately dropped against the pair for lack of evidence. That being said, though, there was a real case with a man by the name of John Hinckley Jr. He is a person who actually came close to shooting Carter during his re-election campaign, but he would ultimately lose his nerve. The crazy part is that though he lost his nerve to try and kill Carter, he would later attempt to kill President Ronald Reagan in March of 1981, which of course actually brings us then to Reagan. I guess for me talking about this, I kind of spoiled it. On March 30th, 1981, as Ronald Reagan was returning to his limousine after speaking at the Washington Hilton Hotel, would-be assassin John Hinckley Jr. would manage to fire 6 gunshots from his revolver and would ultimately manage to strike Reagan as well as 3 others. Reagan was seriously wounded by a bullet that ricocheted off the side of the presidential limousine, and it would hit him in the left underarm, breaking a rib, puncturing a lung, and also causing serious internal bleeding. The president at the time was very close to death, at least upon his arrival at George Washington University Hospital. But in the end, he was stabilized in the emergency room and would then undergo emergency exploratory surgery. He would recover and was ultimately released from the hospital on April 11th. As for the other 3 who were wounded, all of them would survive, but one of them would suffer brain damage and was thus permanently disabled, ultimately dying in 2014, which the death at that time, because it was due to the injuries from this particular shooting, was then determined to be still a homicide. The crazy part about all of this is that Hinckley was immediately arrested, and he would later say that he wanted to kill Reagan, not for any kind of grand-scale political motivations or just for the sake of doing violence, but that he wanted to do it to impress an actress. That's right, he tried to kill the President of the United States in order to get the attention of Jodie Foster. As a result of this, as you can probably guess, he was deemed mentally ill and confined to an institution. For those listening, please do not get political advice from celebrities. But either way, after that, we have George H.W. Bush. On April 13th, 1993, according to Kuwaiti authorities and an FBI investigation, which, mind you, when I talk about this, that is a very important detail, 14 Kuwaiti and Iraqi men believed to be working for Saddam Hussein would smuggle bombs into Kuwait with the plan of assassinating former President Bush by a car bomb during his visit to Kuwait University. The former president was on a visit to Kuwait in order to commemorate the coalition's victory over Iraq in the Persian Gulf War, when Kuwaiti officials claimed to have foiled this attempted assassination plot and arrested the suspects. None of this went through the United States, mind you. This was all through Kuwait. And of the 17 people that Kuwaiti authorities arrested, 2 of the suspects would end up restricting their confessions at trial, claiming that these were confessions that had been coerced. Ultimately, a Kuwaiti court would convict all but 1 of the defendants. This plot was, interestingly enough, one of the justifications that was used for the Iraq resolution authorizing the 2003 U.S. invasion of the country. The crazy part about all that is that an analysis by the CIA's Counterterrorism Center would later conclude that the assassination plot was likely not real, that instead it had been fabricated by Kuwaiti authorities. The FBI, though, would say that it was a real event, and naturally, of course, Kuwaiti authorities would deny that the entire thing was fake. Whether or not any of it was actually real, we don't actually know. But, after all that, we have Bill Clinton. So on January 21st, 1994, Ronald Gene Barber, who was a retired military officer as well as freelance writer, had plotted to kill Clinton while the president was out jogging. Barber would ultimately return to Florida a week later without having actually fired the shots at the president, who was on a state visit to Russia. Despite never firing a shot, he would still end up being captured though, and would be sentenced to 5 years in prison, and was only released in 1998. In another case, on October 29th, 1994, Francisco Martin Duran would fire at least 29 shots with a 7.62 by 39mm Type 56 semi-automatic rifle at the White House from a fence that was overlooking the North Lawn, thinking that Clinton was actually among a number of the men who were in dark suits standing there. Clinton, as it turns out, was inside and not actually there. 3 tourists would manage to tackle Duran before it is that he could seriously injure anyone, and he was found to have a suicide note in his pocket. This was how he planned to go out, but instead, he was ultimately sentenced to 40 years in prison. Fast forward a little bit of time, and on November 24th of 1996, during his visit to the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation, or APEC Forum in Manila, Clinton's motorcade would end up being rerouted before it was set to drive over a bridge. Secret Service officials had intercepted a message that suggested that there was an attack imminent. After having the motorcade be rerouted, a later intelligence team would go and discover a bomb that had been placed under the bridge, with the goal, it seems to be, of having blown the bridge as the US president was driving on it. A subsequent US investigation would reveal that the mastermind behind the entire thing was a Saudi terrorist living in Afghanistan by the name of, can you guess it, Osama bin Laden. That, in turn, brings us up next to George W. Bush. On May 10, 2005, while President Bush was giving a speech in the Freedom Square in Sibley, Georgia, a man by the name of Vladimir would throw a Soviet-made RGD-5 hand grenade towards the podium. The grenade had already had its pin pulled, and theoretically should have immediately blown up. But it did not. It did not explode because a red handkerchief had been wrapped tightly around it, possibly to conceal it, but in the end, this prevented the safety lever from detaching. After escaping that day, Vladimir was ultimately arrested in July of 2005. During his arrest, he would manage to kill an Interior Ministry agent and was convicted in January of 2006 with a life sentence. Although for this next part, we are then most certainly skipping ahead a lot of time, it is something that definitely needs to be said because of just how weird of a case it is. On May 24th, 2022, only 2 years ago at this point, you had an individual by the name of Shabab Ahmed Shabab, an Iraq citizen and a resident of Columbus, Ohio, who was arrested for involvement in a plot to try and assassinate former President Bush based on information that had been obtained from conversations held with a secret undercover agent. This guy was also accused of committing immigration crimes with a plan to illegally smuggle Iraqi nationals into the US from Mexico in order to help assist with the plot of assassinating the former president. He additionally claimed that he had worked with former ISIS leaders and that these people had intended to help him launder money from them into the US via a Columbus car dealership. As you can probably imagine, in the aftermath of this, Shabab would claim to work with Iraqi terrorists to kill as many American servicemen in Iraq as possible from 2003 to 2006 following the invasion. The whole reason as to why he wanted to perform the assassination in the first place was anger over the Iraq War. That, though, brings us to Obama. In December of 2008, a United States Marine, 20-year-old Cody Ray Brittingham, would write that he had taken an oath to, quote, protect against all enemies, both foreign and domestic, in a signed letter of intent, where he identified President Obama as being a domestic enemy, and thus a target of Brittingham's planned assassination plot. If this sounds deranged, it's because it probably is. A search of his barracks would uncover a journal that contained white supremacist material, and ultimately he would be sentenced to 100 months in federal prison. In another incident, in April of 2009, a plot to assassinate Obama at the Alliance of Civilization Summit in Istanbul, Turkey, was discovered after a Syrian man carrying forged Al Jazeera TV press credentials was found. The man would confess to Turkish security services that he specifically planned to kill Obama with a knife. As for how he planned on actually getting close to be able to do that, we don't really know, but he alleged that he had 3 more accomplices. Later on then, in November of 2011, there would be another incident with a 21-year-old man by the name of Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez, who was apparently inspired by a number of different conspiracy theories and would try to murder Obama. He would travel from his native Idaho, where he would hit the White House with several rounds fired from a semi-automatic rifle. Now, when this happened, no one was actually injured, but he did manage to break a window. Ultimately, he would be arrested and sentenced to 25 years in prison. That same year of 2011, and moving on into 2012, there was a far-right terrorist organization called FEAR, though it was very small in number. It was something that plotted to carry out a series of terror attacks, which included assassinating the president at the time, Obama. The plot, though, was ultimately foiled when 4 members of the group were arrested on murder charges, and one of them decided to communicate and cooperate with authorities in order to get a lighter sentence. So the plot ultimately went nowhere. Next up on this list in October of 2012, and I'm not sure if this is actually something that ends up counting, but there was a mentally ill man, which is something that is a common theme in this entire story, by the name of Mitchell Cusick of Westminster, Colorado, who ended up being arrested after confessing to his therapist that he planned to kill Obama with a shotgun at his campaign stop in Boulder, Colorado. Of course, nothing ended up happening from this, and he was reported, but still, there was apparently a plan, and yet still there would be more. In April of 2013, another attempt was made when a letter that was laced with toxic ricin was sent to Obama. This would not be the only thing that was mailed to him, though, as in 2018, Obama was among many different Democratic high-ranking party members who were set to receive pipe bombs in the mail. But obviously, this did not actually work. And that, my friends, in turn, brings us back full circle to Trump, but not for the incident that we were talking about at the beginning of this video. On September 6th, 2017, a man by the name of Gregory Lee Lingang, a 42-year-old man from Bismarck, North Dakota, would try to assassinate President Donald Trump in Mandan, North Dakota, while he was visiting the state to rally public support. The reason that I bring this up here in the first place, and why among all things that we have possibly talked about, this is the weirdest one, is that this whole thing probably did not need to go down as an attempted assassination attempt. See, Lingang didn't take a gun, he didn't get a bomb, he didn't get poison, he didn't get anything like that. Instead, he stole a forklift from an oil refinery and drove towards the presidential motorcade. Yes, you heard me right. He stole a forklift and intended to use that to take out the president. But after the forklift ended up becoming jammed within the refinery, he fled on foot and ended up getting arrested by pursuing police. The crazy part about all this is that they had no idea that he was actually planning on doing this, not at all. When he was being interviewed after being detained by police, it is there that he would admit that his plan was to murder the president by taking the forklift and flipping the presidential limousine with it. The authorities were naturally quite shocked. They literally thought that the whole reason that he stole the forklift was because he was just trying to go for a joyride, that he was stealing it for his personal use, not to assassinate the frickin' president. As you can imagine, after that, he would ultimately plead guilty to the attempted attack, as well as stealing the forklift, among a number of other things. Consequently, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. That is most certainly the weirdest one that we've probably talked about here, but it's not the only one for Trump. In November of 2017, there was a man who was affiliated with the Islamic State, whose name was never actually revealed, and was arrested by the Philippine National Police in Rizal Park, Manila, for reportedly planning to assassinate Trump during the diplomatic ASEAN summit. In the week prior to the failed attempt, the Secret Service already suspected that there was going to be some kind of attack upon the president because of the general presence of the Islamic State in the Philippines, and also because of the large number of threats by many people against him on social media. In the end, the Secret Service would discover a credible terrorist threat from a man who threatened to kill the president on social media, quickly tracking him down and arresting him. Nothing would ultimately come from this, and the entire incident was revealed only a year later. And that, my friends, then brings us to the last incident to touch upon here, with the then current, at least at the time that I am making this video, President Joe Biden, of which, from what I have found, there is only one credible incident that has actually happened. On May 23rd, 2023, a man by the name of Sai Varshith Kandula, a 19-year-old from Chesterfield, Missouri, would drive a rented box truck into a barrier that separated the White House grounds from the public. Shortly after this, he was captured and taken into custody by the United States Park Police, and inside the truck, he was found to have a German National Socialist flag, which, of course, with the name, I can say it on here, but of course, with everything I've talked about, it's YouTube. You know exactly what it is that I'm referring to. Kandula had expressed admiration for the Third Reich and stated that his intentions were to, quote, kill the president and then seize power. Honestly, when I talk about this, there's really no more details besides that, and I really do not know what it is that he possibly thought that he could actually accomplish there, or what would happen, or how he could possibly seize power as an individual in a truck. But either way, it doesn't matter. That happened. And now we have the attempted assassination of Trump, at a point where the United States is arguably more divided than it has ever been, as the presidential elections loom this coming November. When I talk about this, my friends, no good can come out of this kind of action. And to those watching, I hope that you maintain a cooler head than the individuals that I have spoken about in this video. Besides that, we've really reached the end of today's episode. My friends, thank you all very much for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast, and I hope that from everything that I've covered here, which is a little bit different than what I've normally done here with geopolitics, that you have learned something with it today. With that, I will see you all next time. Goodbye, my friends, and thank you for watching.